Music often echoes history, and perhaps the most famous piece of historical music ever written is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. Not only because it's so dramatic, but also because the year 1812 was a milestone in European history. But it was also a year of great significance in the history of Canada, which had an 1812 of its own. In fact, the two 1812s were closely related.
Niagara, an Iroquoian word meaning thunder of water. The great waterfall in the river, which links Lake Erie with Lake Ontario. On one side of this Niagara River is the United States. On the other, only about 200 meters away, lies Canada. In October of 1812, the Canadian bank of the Niagara River, known as Queenston Heights, was invaded by an American army. This was the first important engagement in a conflict that would continue for 2 years, but which would become known simply as the War of 1812. To understand why the United States launched an attack on Canada at this particular moment, we have to go to Europe, then embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was now Emperor of France, was doing his level best to take over the world, and he very nearly succeeded. By the early 1800s, Napoleon had assembled one of the mightiest armies in history and was undertaking the systematic conquest of country after country. By 1812, Napoleon dominated virtually the whole of Europe, right up to the borders of Russia. The only thing stopping him from expanding his empire beyond Europe was the all-powerful British Navy, which had sealed off almost the entire continent with a huge blockade of warships, thus preventing Napoleon's fleet from getting out of any of the French-controlled ports. The trouble was, the British blockade also prevented anyone from getting into the European ports as well. This included the Americans, whose economy was now becoming more and more dependent on trade with Europe. This blow to their business interests naturally turned the United States once more against the mother country. The British made things even worse by boarding U.S. ships on the high seas in search of deserters from the extremely harsh life in the Royal Navy, often press-ganging American sailors into the service of His Majesty at the same time. Meanwhile, back on this continent, the U.S. population was continuing to expand rapidly, spreading ever further west in search of new territory. British North America seemed the logical next step in the U.S. takeover of the continent, and the Napoleonic Wars provided the perfect opportunity. On the one hand, the British troops were now tied down in Europe fighting Napoleon, so Canada should be easy pickings. On the other hand, the British interruption of American trade with Europe and their high-handed raids on American ships presented the United States with a convenient excuse for declaring war on Great Britain and invading Canada. So the American attack on Queenston Heights in the autumn of 1812 was to a large extent an offshoot of the Napoleonic Wars. Once again, there was a crucial French connection in the evolution of North America. If the Americans had won their war of independence thanks to the intervention of France, they now seemed all set to win Canada, thanks to Napoleon.
In the year 1812, there was a struggle for survival on two continents. Europe was on the point of being taken over by France, and Canada seemed about to be taken over by the United States. But at the end of that year, an event occurred that was to foil both of these takeover bids.
This looks like a Canadian winter, but it isn't. It's a Russian winter. And the key to understanding both how Canada avoided being annexed by the United States in the early 1800s and how Europe escaped becoming a mere extension of France. Once again, Napoleon was at the center of all this. Having conquered almost all of Europe, by the middle of 1812, he turned his attention to Russia and marched a gigantic army of over 500,000 men from Poland to Moscow. This was his fatal mistake. Napoleon took Moscow itself easily enough in the autumn of that year, but when he demanded that Tsar Alexander surrender his Russian Empire to France, the Tsar stood firm, and Napoleon had no alternative but to retreat. Unfortunately, winter was now coming on, and Napoleon's men had to fight their way back through thousands of kilometers of snow and ice. Out of a total of 600,000 troops, only 30,000 survived. Napoleon never fully recovered from this disaster. From then on, he was to lose more and more of his battles with the other European states, until, by the end of 1814, all the lands he had conquered beyond the borders of France had been returned to their former owners. But if the retreat from Moscow had saved Europe from French domination, it was also to be one of the major factors in saving Canada from assimilation by the United States. During most of the War of 1812, because of Britain's involvement in the Napoleonic Wars, she could only send a token force of a few thousand men to defend British North America. This encouraged the Americans to attack Canada on several fronts, including Queenston Heights on the Niagara River, York, the capital of Upper Canada, later called by its original Indian name Toronto, and the southern approaches to Montreal. Although a combination of British, Canadian, and native troops put up a valiant fight under the leadership of such men as Isaac Brock and his Shawnee Indian ally Tecumseh in Upper Canada, and Charles de Salaberry in Lower Canada, it still seemed inevitable that the United States must eventually overrun British North America, if only by sheer force of numbers. But then the tide turned, or rather, the snow fell in that calamitous Russian winter, which ultimately led to the collapse of France. At last, Britain could release troops from her struggle with Napoleon and send them across the Atlantic. Now, it was America's turn to be invaded, as the British Army marched on various strategic sites in the U.S. The symbolic climax of this invasion was the capture and burning of the American capital, Washington, in retaliation for the burning of the parliamentary buildings at York. This included the desecration of the presidential mansion itself, which was subsequently rebuilt and painted a dazzling white, as if in an act of purification. Soon, both sides came to realize that this was a senseless conflict, and on Christmas Eve 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, bringing a formal end to the War of 1812. This actually left the territorial division of North America exactly as before. The only new development being the subsequent extension of the frontier in 1818, along the 49th parallel, all the way to the Rocky Mountains. The War of 1812 ended in stalemate, but it discouraged the Americans from ever again mounting a direct attack on this country.